Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the part two of the Windows Hello for Business concepts webinar. Uh, this will continue on in the configuration, and this part will consist of some technical demonstrations and enablement for Windows Hello for Business. Does build on the overall Zero Trust concepts for the series. This session will be recorded, and you can put them together for the other ones if you're unable to or did miss the first part of it. And I'll turn it over to Chris for the presentation today. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Jim. So real quick, as Jim mentioned, this is part two of our Windows Hello for Business sessions as part of our passwordless authentication series. So we did have an intro to passwordless. We went through a lot of the concepts and the theory behind passwordless authentication. And then last week we talked about how all that plays into how Windows Hello for Business works. And then today we're going to talk about taking what we've gone over in those two previous sessions and putting it into practice and going through some demonstration on how to set Windows Hello for Business up in a real environment. And then next week we will wrap up our passwordless authentication series with focusing on the Microsoft Authenticator and FIDO2 security keys as passwordless authentication options. So a real quick high-level agenda. Most of this is going to be demo, so a very light agenda here, but I want to touch upon the requirements for enabling Windows Hello for Business, and then I'm just going to give a high-level view of what the implementation steps will be that we'll walk through, and then I'll actually walk through them so that we can see what it looks like in a real-world environment. So let's jump in. So requirements for Windows Hello for Business. If you did attend our previous sessions, you would have heard us speak about there's multiple deployment models for Windows Hello for Business. There is a cloud, a hybrid, and an on-prem deployment model. And the names pretty much reflect how they're used. Cloud deployment model is cloud use only, no on-prem resources to authenticate to. The on-prem deployment is the polar opposite, where everything's on-prem, no cloud services to authenticate to. But most of us are going to operate in that middle ground, in the hybrid model, to where we have both on-premises services, applications, network services, whatnot, that we have to authenticate to. That's tied into our on-premises Active Directory. And then we're also going to have Microsoft Cloud services like Office 365 that we're going to have to authenticate to. So we're going to focus on that hybrid model because that's going to be the most common deployment model out there today. Within that hybrid deployment model, there were technically three, but two usable trust modes. One is the key trust mode, and the other was certificate trust mode, and that's where certificates are pretty much being used and issued from an enterprise PKI. Key trust is using user key pairs. So you can review our previous two sessions to kind of get a background on what that means when we talk about a key pair. There is a third trust mode that is in preview right now called Cloud Trust, which has different requirements than what we have here. But again, I'm focusing on the most common deployments that adopt Windows Hello for Business, and that would be a hybrid key trust model. So in key trust, we have first off the endpoint, the Windows device. As you can see here, Windows 10, 15, 11 or higher is required. So Windows Hello for Business was a feature that was rolled out with Windows 10. It did not exist, or it does not exist, with anything lower. So can't use Windows Hello for Business on a Windows 8 or a Windows 7 device if you still have those floating around in your environments. You have to be at Windows 10, 15, 11 or higher, which most of us should be if you're running a current and supported version or build of Windows 10 or Windows 11 today. Another component or requirement around the endpoint is it has to be hybrid Azure AD joined. And this goes back to the device trust that we have to establish. So the Windows Hello for Business credential is a passwordless credential, and a passwordless credential is tied to the device, the physical hardware in which it was created. And hybrid Azure AD join is establishing that degree of trust between the device and Azure that pretty much allows it to validate that, hey, yes, this is the same device that registered the Windows Hello for Business credential. So hybrid Azure AD join is required in a hybrid model. From an Active Directory perspective, you may recall from our previous session that Windows Server 2016 or higher domain controllers are a requirement. And the main reason for this is because the key-based authentication was something that was introduced in Windows Server 2016. Now, it doesn't mean that all of your domain controllers have to be Windows Server 2016. You can still have Windows 2012 R2 or just base R 2012 floating out there, but you have to have at least one Windows Server 2016 domain controller that is directly accessible by the endpoints that will be authenticated using Windows Hello for Business. So having at least one domain controller is a requirement, but most likely, if you want to kind of the recommended or best practice, have all of your domain controllers at least Windows Server 2016. And that's the operating system level. The functional level, though, only needs to be 2008 R2, and that's for both the forest and the domain. I do have listed here Windows Server 2012 or later for a certification authority or PKI. You could technically use a third-party PKI here. You don't necessarily have to use Windows-based certificate services, but it's a lot easier because there's going to be some dependencies, and we'll walk through those. You'll see for firsthand as we go through the demo why having a Windows-based certification authority makes sense and is easier to manage and integrate with Windows Hello for Business. So if you are running that internal PKI with Windows Server, it has to be 2012 or later. Azure AD Connect, or previously known as DirSync, is a requirement for synchronization between the on-premises directory and the cloud Azure AD directory. And this is necessary, going back to the workflow in our previous session, because there are certain attributes on user objects and computer objects that need to be reflected in both on-prem and in the cloud. And the way that we do that is by synchronizing those objects. So Azure AD Connect is a requirement. Now, from a licensing perspective, I have Azure AD Premium listed here, and oddly enough, it's not a requirement for Windows Hello specifically, but it's a requirement for one of the dependencies for Windows Hello for Business, and that is multi-factor authentication. So if you recall, a passwordless credential is considered what's called a strong credential. We can't provision a passwordless credential with just a simple username and password. That's not a strong credential. You can only provision another strong credential by using a strong credential, and that means we have to upstep our username and password with MFA, and that is something that if you want to make that available to all users in the organization, you typically have to have Azure AD Premium, P1 at least. Now, I also have Intune listed here, but I have a little star by that because it's not a requirement, but it is if you want to leverage some of the cloud-based management for some of the policies versus using group policy. I'm going to walk through the group policy process in our demo here, but if you wanted to leverage Intune and device management from the cloud, you could use that as an alternative. And in that case, you would have to have Intune licensing available as well. So high-level process or outline of the steps that we're going to walk through. This is the different steps that we're going to go through on the demo here. But first is we need to validate our prerequisites. Just make sure we have all the necessary bits and pieces in place to support Windows Hello for Business. And then we're going to put something in place to scope out our Windows Hello for Business rollout, because most likely you don't want to just deploy this across your entire organization at once. You're going to want to test it out. You're going to want to deploy it to a set of pilot users first. So we'll see how we do that. And then there's some modifications that we need to make for directory synchronization services, specifically around the service accounts used by Azure AD Connect, because there's certain attributes that it's going to have to be able to synchronize that by default it doesn't have permissions to modify. So we'll walk through the change that we need to make there. And then the fourth step is configuring some certificate templates. Now, this is where it's going to be a lot different from a key trust model and a certificate trust model, because in our key trust, we're not issuing user certificates. So we actually have a much lighter impact or dependency on the PKI, but there is still some modifications you have to make. So we'll walk through what those look like. And then finally, how do we enable Windows Hello for Business to the user population? And we'll define what those policies look like. As I said, we'll use group policy to go through that, but if you had Intune, you could technically use Intune instead to deploy some of these policies out to the endpoints. So with that, I am going to jump into my demo here. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, I have a very basic environment set up. I've got it running on some virtual machines on my laptop here, but I've got a domain controller, I've got a Directory Connect server, and I've got a endpoint, a Windows client. So first, let me log into my domain controller. And you can see here I've got a test user, Leonard Hofstadter. If you're a fan of The Big Bang Theory, that name will be familiar to you. But that is my test user here in my lab. And then I've got the computer object that represents my Windows endpoint. So it is a domain joined computer. And I've just got it in a OU here that I have set up for synchronization to my Azure AD environment. So if we take a step back and we think about what those requirements were, again, this is a Active Directory domain here. My domain is improvingdemos.com. You can see I'm running this on a domain controller that is Windows Server 2019. Again, have to be 2016 or above to support the key trust model for Active Directory-based authentication. Now, because this is a lab, I do have certificate services also installed on my domain controller. Definitely not a best practice. In your production environment, you are probably not going to want to deploy certificate services on your domain controllers. But since this is a lab and I didn't want to have to spin up additional VMs outside of this, I just co-located it on my domain controller. Perfectly fine for a lab or a proof of concept environment, but definitely not recommended for a production environment. So next thing, let's see, Active Directory users and computers here. So my functional level, it is a 2019 domain controller, but my functional level is 2016 for both domain and forest. Again, 2008 R2 is the minimum, so definitely meeting that requirement here. As I also mentioned, I did have certificate services, so let me open this up. And you can see the only certificate that's really been issued is one that is issued to my domain controller, which is the same server here, and it's using the domain controller certificate template. That's going to become important to remember here in a little bit, as we're going to make some modifications to certificate templates. So you can see that's the only cert that I've issued from my PKI, but it is the second cert because technically I'm not being shown here the CA cert itself. So if I looked at, let's see, cert if I looked at the local machine certificate store, and that doesn't want to open from the start menu. Here we go. If you look here, you'll see two certs issued to my server. One is using that domain controller certificate template, as I just pointed out. The other cert here is just the root CA cert because this is my root CA. So again, keep those in mind because part of the demo here, we're going to be making modifications to the certificate templates that are used. So that pretty much highlights the main dependencies. Again, I've got Directory Connect in place. I do have my tenant up here, my Office or Azure AD tenant. I've got the Azure AD Premium P1 license enabled for my users. Actually more than that, but you can see I've got my user licensed for E5 Security, which has the Azure AD P1 or P2 license technically included with it. So I'm checking off all the prerequisites for hybrid so far, or Windows Hello for Business and a hybrid model so far. So the next thing we need to do is establish the device trust. And there's a couple ways to do this, but the path of least resistance is using your Azure AD Connect server. If I can log in here. Okay. So Back in our previous session, we did talk about how this whole device registration process works. I'm not going to rehash all of that here, but ultimately it comes down to a service connection point record being created within our Active Directory domain, our on-prem Active Directory domain. So Azure AD Connect makes that configuration pretty simple. And you can do that just by launching the Azure AD Connect configuration app here, and then we're going to select the configure device options. This will give us the option to enable hybrid Azure AD join, which is what we're going to target here because we're domain joined computers, and now we need to make them Azure AD joined as well, and that is hybrid Azure AD join. But we could also enable the device write back capability through this process as well. Not necessary for what we're doing, but it's an option here when you go through the device configuration in Azure AD Connect. So I'll authenticate to our cloud directory, and then I'm just given the option, hey, configure hybrid Azure AD join. That's what I want to do, so I'm going to click next. I'm going to check the box for Windows 10 or later. Now, you may recall me saying that Windows Hello for Business is only supported on Windows 10, 15, build 1511 and higher. Hybrid Azure AD join is supported for Windows 10 and Windows 7 and Windows 8 devices. So it's not, Windows Hello for Business is not synonymous with hybrid Azure AD join. Because we're focusing on Windows Hello for Business, I'm only going to select the Windows 10 and later devices here. But if I had Windows 8 and I had Windows 7 devices out there, this is technically the workplace join capability that we could enable. And it's a little bit of a different process for those down level versions of Windows. But the next screen here says that we need to configure the SCP, or that service connection point. So if I had multiple force that I was enabling this for, that were in my environment, I'd have the option to select it here because this SCP is forest specific. So I would have to create a record in each forest. But I'm pretty much just going to select my improving demos, use Azure AD as my authentication service, and then I have to give it enterprise admin credentials because it is making a root change in Active Directory. Now, if I didn't have enterprise credentials, I could download a script here that Microsoft makes available through the Directory Connect, and then I could have this run by someone who does have enterprise admin credentials. But Microsoft has provided the script here to go ahead and do the configuration for you, and that's all that's really going to run behind the scenes when I finish this process here. So we'll do some validation checks for Azure AD Connect before it gives me the option to actually put those changes into effect. But when I click configure here, it's going to go through really fast. All it's doing is creating a SCP record in my Active Directory environment. So I'll go ahead and click exit. Now, if I wanted to control, maybe I shouldn't get ahead of myself here. Let me take a look at my Windows endpoint. Just because I've configured that SCP record doesn't mean that all of a sudden my Windows endpoint is now magically hybrid Azure AD joined. It has to do something now. And one way you can check the state of each device is running a command called dsregcmd and passing it the status switch. And what this is going to do is it's going to give you an output of what is the device state. You can see here Azure AD join says no. I am domain joined though, because it does recognize that I'm a member of the improvingdemos.com domain. So that's what I would expect at this point, because enabling the SCP doesn't actually do anything. What has to happen is a triggering event. And we talked about the trigger event back in the previous session, but what Windows 10, 1511, and higher have built in is a scheduled task. And this is part of Windows itself. It's all the way under here in the user device registration. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the event viewer. I wanted to look at scheduled tasks. Thought it was up here. Let me pull it up. Whoops, I just opened that on my host, not my VM. Here we go. All right, so in here, This is where we find that Windows scheduled task. So it's under Microsoft, Windows, and then all the way down here, there should be, if I am remembering correctly, the workplace join. There we go. Yeah, my eyes were playing tricks on me. So under workplace join, we have this automatic device join task. This is, again, predefined as built into Windows 15, 11, and higher. But if you look at the actions, it's pretty much calling that same command that I just ran to get the status. But in this case, it would perform a join of the device. Now, this does have to run underneath the context of the system. I can't run this as a user. I can run the status command as a user, which is fine because I'm just retrieving the status. But I can't actually I can't right click this and hit run. It'll error out because it can only run under the system context. But what are the triggers? The triggers for this are log on of any user. So when a user logs into the machine, this task will run. And then after that, it's going to run pretty much every hour after the user logs in. So the first thing we need to do is pretty much just re-log in. So I could just do a log off and log back in. That should do it. But I'm just going to restart just to be safe here. What will happen that when that scheduled task runs is that the Windows endpoint is going to reach out to Active Directory. It knows it's a member of the domain, and it's going to look for that SCP record. And that SCP record is going to contain 2 bits of information. It's going to contain the tenant ID that is associated with my Office 365 tenant. And then it's also going to include the tenant name or domain name. So the tenant ID is a GUID. The tenant domain name it can be your custom domain. And I'll actually show you how we can kind of define these ourselves manually if we needed to as well. So I'll show you what those look like here in a minute. But anyways, now I've logged into the device. Let's go back into command prompt and run that dsreg command. And what we will see is that we are not joined still. And this is expected, right? This task may have run, but we're still not Azure AD joined. If you wonder why, we have to go back to our previous session on how the device registration process works. So what has happened is my endpoint has essentially created a self-signed cert and is trying to send that up to Azure AD to validate its identity, but it doesn't send that public cert up, the public key of the cert up via any kind of direct send or HTTPS or anything. It actually writes it to the on-premises Active Directory user or computer object. So what I really have to wait for is directory sync to kick off. Luckily, I can just come in here and hit PowerShell on my Azure AD Connect server and run the command start AD sync cycle. And that will initiate a synchronization run, which will update the computer object. And I should be able to see that here if I open up the synchronization service. Let's give that time. Let's see, it's export into the cloud right now. Okay, so you can see here it did an actual add, even though my computer object was in the sync scope, but it's now added my device up into Azure AD. And this is the key part right here. User certificate, this value, this attribute is that public key of the self-signed certificate that my Windows 11 endpoint just created. And you might think, well, hey, it's a self-signed cert. Why would anyone trust it? And the reality is no one does other than that Windows 11 device. But Azure AD trusts Azure AD Connect. It trusts what is being synchronized up because it assumes whatever is being synchronized up is being written to Active Directory, right? So by writing this public key value to the computer object on-prem and using synchronization to send that up to Azure AD, now when Azure AD sees that value, it's going to trust it even though it's a self-signed cert because it knows it came from the on-prem Active Directory. So right here, you can still see I'm still not Azure AD joined. If I rerun the command, it's still going to say I'm not Azure AD joined. And that is expected because we haven't triggered another login event. Now I could sit here for another hour and wait for that to trigger itself, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to simply log off and then log back in. And that should trigger that event to run again. And if the demo gods are playing nice today, we will see that that is now fully hybrid Azure AD joined. And of course it's not yet. Let me just do this. Shouldn't have to. I'm just going to do a quick restart on this VM. I shouldn't have to do this. It should have picked up once I did the synchronization, but you know, this is a process that typically you expect to happen over the natural occurrence of AD sync cycles and then user logon activities. So it's not something that you expect to go into effect immediately. As part of this demo, we're trying to force it to come up immediately. So not joining the first time here is not a surprise. All right, here we are now joined. You can see here Azure AD join says yes, and some of the other important details that have been pulled down, the tenant details. So it now knows the URLs for my, pretty much my device registration service, which is up in Azure, enterprise registration.windows.net. So it knows how to reach out to that because it pulled the SCP record from Azure AD, and it completed the join because it could validate that certificate that my endpoint created. Now, the end result is really that Azure AD has now issued me a certificate. So if I look at the certificate store on this computer, I now have an org access certificate that has been issued by Azure AD. So now I have a trusted third-party cert issued by Azure AD, therefore Azure AD will trust it to validate this device's identity. So that pretty much wraps up the, how do we get hybrid Azure AD joined to work? But one thing I will point out is that enabling that SCP record is going to impact every Windows 10, 15, 11 device or higher that you have in your organization, because it's a built-in task. It's going to try to run automatically. There's nothing you have to enable on the endpoints for that to kick in. It's just going to run. So maybe you don't want to deploy that to everybody. Maybe you don't want to impact every endpoint in your environment all at once. So if you needed to scope that down, you can do that in a couple of different ways. I'm going to show you the group policy approach. But you could take two different approaches here. One is you could create a group policy object here, and I'm not going to assign it anywhere because I'm not going to use it, but I'll create one here. And I'm just going to call this hybrid AD join. So if you wanted to scope this to computers that you wanted to impact directly, right, a set of pilot computers, you could create this GPO and you could scope it to just those computers that you wanted to impact. And what we would be doing is just creating some registry settings, and that's done through the computer configuration, preferences, control panel. Nope, I'm sorry, not control panel. Windows settings and registry. I'm going to expand this so we see the full view. And here we would create two objects, two registry objects. I would recommend you browse to this path because manually typing it in is probably going to be very susceptible to typos, which could possibly result in some undesirable effects. But where we want to point this to, get down here first. we want to start with software, Microsoft, or I'm sorry, local machine, software, Microsoft, Windows, current version. Now, the rest we have to type in because these keys don't exist, and that is CDJ/AAD. That is the key path. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to copy this value because I'm going to have to create another key value so I don't have to duplicate this. But what we want to call this is tenant ID, and then what we would paste in here is the tenant ID of our Azure AD tenant. So let me grab that. You can get this from your Azure AD portal. So that's the first value that we need to create. The second value goes to the same path, and I have to go back and copy the path because I copied the tenant ID. Here we go. So same path, but this one will be tenant name. And in here, this is where I'll put improvingdemos.com. This could be your tenant domain name as like improvingdemos.onmicrosoft.com. Both will be valid here because it's really just identifying the tenant. But you could deploy this group policy then to whatever test computers that you wanted to include in your Azure AD deployment. And this way you're only impacting, you're kind of simulating that that SCP record exists, even though it doesn't. It's just tricking those devices. So that's how you could do that manually and control that. So we've got our hybrid join configured. What we want to do is scope down our hybrid join, our Windows Hello for Business credential provisioning. So maybe you don't want to impact all of the users across your entire organization. So we'll create a group. And we'll call this Windows Hello for Business users. If I can type correctly. Here we go. So I have a group, and I am going to add my test user into this group. Right? And that's pretty much it. You know, we're pretty much just saying, hey, we have a group that we'll be able to leverage for future settings that we're going to target for Windows Hello for Business. Nothing rocket science here, just kind of typical permissioning. Now, the other step, or the next step that we need to go through, if you remember me saying that we have to update the directory sync service account. By default, it doesn't have permissions to make changes to certain attributes on user objects. And specifically, those have to do with key value attributes. So there is an admin group that has already delegated this permission in Active Directory. This is a built-in group, but it's called key admins. So in here, what we want to do is add in our Azure AD service account. And right here, I'm using the MSOL _ as my service account. But if we went back to Azure AD Connect, you can see which account you're using just by coming in and looking at your current configuration. You can see the account being used is the MSOL _ B4, and then the rest of the GUID there, or the string. So that's all I'm adding into this key admins. By doing that, I've now given that service account the necessary permissions to update and modify the key-based values in Active Directory. Pretty simple to make that change and add in the permissions. So we've just knocked out several of our steps, but now our next step is probably the most impactful, and that is making modifications to certificate services. So let me pull up, here we go, our certificates, nope, that's our local machine store. There we go, our certification authority console. So in here, if I look at the certificate templates, these are the certificate templates that are available to be issued by my issuing CA. But it doesn't mean that these are all of the templates that are available. The templates are stored in Active Directory. That's one of the benefits of using an AD integrated PKI, is that it comes with all these pre-built templates that automatically get registered within Active Directory. Otherwise, you would have to build these, or at least the ones that we're working on next. But what we need to do first is create a new certificate template. And this really comes back to, let's see, where is it? Kerberos authentication. We're going to create a custom version of the Kerberos authentication certificate. And the reason we have to do this is when this certificate was designed, it wasn't designed in mind with, or Windows Hello for Business didn't exist. So there's certain things on this template that don't align to Windows Hello for Business. So we're going to create a custom one. So I'm just going to right click it. I'm going to say duplicate template. You don't want to modify the default templates because they are the default templates and you can never go back to them if you make changes, because these are all stored in Active Directory. So the next CA I deploy, it would pull from all of these templates. So I'm going to create a custom one because we just don't want to modify those defaults. So the first thing we need to do is make the certification authority, the compatibility settings, align with 2008 R2. And we'll get a warning here, but we can ignore that. And then we want to create the certificate recipient settings to Windows 7/Server 2008 R2. Kind of the same warnings there, just kind of telling you what doesn't work anymore or what works differently with those compatibility settings. So I am then going to change the name of this. I'm going to call this, instead of just being copy of Kerberos authentication, I'm going to call this domain controller Kerberos authentication. You can name it whatever you want, but I think this makes a little bit more sense to me. So that's what I'm going to name it. And then we need to go to, let's see, which part? We need to go to the key storage provider. Why am I drawing a blank on where that is? There we go. So in here, we want to set this provider category to key storage provider, not the legacy cryptographic service provider, but the key storage provider. And we want to set our hash to SHA-256. Now, the default should be a minimum key size of 2048. You shouldn't have to change it, but just calling it out here, if it's not set to 2048, make sure that this is set to 2048. Otherwise, the certificate template may not work as desired. And then there's one last change that we need to make that is very important, and that comes into the superseded templates. So most likely your domain controllers, and we've even seen here, if I looked at the local certificate store on my domain controller, it's already enrolled for a domain controller authentication template. The reality is we want to replace that certificate with our new template. And the way that we do that is we add in here certificate templates that are superseded by our template. So what I want to select is domain controller authentication, and Kerberos authentication. So pretty much what I'm saying is that our cert template now replaces all three of these. So if a system already has one of these certs based on one of these three templates, the next time it renews, it will now use our template instead. So I'll go ahead and click apply and OK. You can see now my template is now available or visible in the Active Directory store for all the cert templates. But just because it's there doesn't mean that it's going to be used. So the next step I need to do is close out of the cert template, but come back to my certification authority, click on new cert to issue or cert template to issue. And this is going to make my certificate template, the new one, available by my certification authority to now be issued from this server, right? So before, the cert template existed in AD, but my certification authority had no awareness to try to issue it. Now it knows it and it will try to issue that cert template. But we also need to make sure it's not going to try to issue certs that are using templates that we are now superseding or trying to replace. So I'm going to have to remove the domain controller authentication, and the Kerberos authentication cert templates from my CA. If I come back in here and click manage, you'll see that those cert templates still exist. I didn't delete them from Active Directory. I simply just removed them from my issuing CA right here. So this brings up the idea that you could technically have a dedicated PKI or a CA that is used for certification authority that is used for Windows Hello for Business. Your domain controllers can pull certs from multiple sources. That's fine. But if you can't remove those templates for some reason in your enterprise PKI, it doesn't mean that you can't stand up a secondary or another issuing CA that does remove those, and that does have our domain controller Kerberos authentication custom template available, right? So I'm not doing that because this is my demo environment. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. But if there are any concerns about removing those other templates from being issued from this CA, just note that you could stand up another issuing CA and make the change on that new CA. But just because our cert template is now available, it doesn't mean that anyone's going to be using it, at least not immediately. So that's where we come back to group policy. Now I'm going to create a group policy that applies to my domain controllers by creating and linking a new policy to the domain controller's OU. But you could use an existing group policy object. You can modify one that you already have to do what we're going to do here, or you can create a new one. It's up to you, but I'm just going to create a new one because it's the easiest. And we're going to name this domain controller certificate auto enrollment. So we're pretty much going to say, hey, this is how our domain controllers are going to auto enroll for certificates. And therefore, we're going to kind of trigger our certificate to go into effect. So I'm going to select my new GPO object. I'll select edit. And I'm going to do this in the computer configuration underneath policies, Windows settings, security settings. Expand this out a little bit here. And then public key policies. So in here, we have a couple of policy settings here, but the one that we want to select is this certificate services client auto enrollment. So I'm going to double click on that, and I'm going to say enabled. Now, some important settings that we want to click here are renew expired certs, update pending certs, and remove revoked certs, and then update certificates that use cert templates. This is an important one because it's going to now see our new certificate template. It's going to see that custom one that has those superseded templates defined. So because it sees our new cert template, it's going to see that, it's going to read the template and say, hey, domain controller authentication is superseded. I have one of those certs. Let me enroll for a new cert using this new template to replace my existing cert. That's essentially what we're making happen here. So this does affect the domain controller, which I'm currently logged into. So let's see, where's my cert store? That is my CA. I thought I had my local certificates. Okay, so you can see here, the current certificate that I have, if I refresh this, still says the same thing. Cert template is domain controller. So what I'm going to do is just do a simple GP update. Course, and that should pull down our new certificate template. So computer has updated successfully. There we go. So now if I refresh this, you'll see that domain controller authentication cert has now been replaced with our domain controller Kerberos authentication certificate. You'll also see this directory email replication cert pop up, and that's really just because that is another certificate that is scoped to auto enrollment. So there's some cert settings there that make them capable of auto enrollment. This is one of them, so we got one of those as well. But that's not a problem for what we're doing. The main thing is we have this certificate, and that's going to support our Windows Hello for Business, at least from the domain controller identity validation perspective. All right. So we've gone through the device registration. We've created a group that we can scope our Windows Hello for Business rollout to. We've prepped our directory connect by enabling it to write the necessary key attributes on user objects. And now we've set up our certificate services. Again, we're in key trust mode, so we're not issuing user certificates. Otherwise, we'd have a lot more to do here. But we're in key trust, so we don't have to do anything for user certs. Our next step is to pretty much say, hey, let's go ahead and create a policy to enable Windows Hello for Business. How do we get our users to start enrolling now for Windows Hello for Business? And this is where I'm going to go back to group policy. So I do have this OU AAD sync, and this has all my objects that are being synchronized via Directory Connect. So what I'm going to do here is create and link a new group policy, and I'm going to call this Windows Hello for Business Enrollment. All right, and then this new policy, we have a couple different options. We can apply this at either the user or the computer. We have two different options. If you apply it to the computer, if you use the computer configuration, first off, it has to be applied somewhere where the computer objects live for it to use this policy. But if you apply the configuration to the computer, then any user that logs into that computer will be run through the Windows Hello for Business credential provision and process. If you apply it at the user level, then only the user that has that policy applied will go through the Windows Hello for Business credential registration. So there's different scenarios to where you'd want to use each, right? If you have kiosk computers that you don't want users registering Windows Hello for Business credentials on, then probably not a good idea to use the computer configuration unless you link that policy only to an OU that contains standard user devices, right? But if you wanted only a select group of users to register for Windows Hello for Business, regardless of what computer they use, then we would use the user policy. So I'm just going to go ahead and set up the user policy. It's the simplest. And if we talk about the precedence, if we had both policies defined, user policy wins. So if for some reason in here I said under the user policy, enable Windows Hello for Business, and then under the computer policy I said explicitly disabled Windows Hello for Business, my user policy setting of enabled would take precedence. But if you didn't see that path that I just went through, it's user config, policies, admin templates, Windows components, down to Windows Hello for Business. Now, if you have an older domain that you've upgraded over the years, you may not have this template available, and that's simply just updating your group policy management template store with the newest templates available for the current versions of Windows operating systems. So you can add that in if you don't see it. But the main thing that we want to enable here is use Windows Hello for Business. Seems pretty straightforward, right? So if we open up that setting, we just want to say enabled, but we do have this checkbox to say do not start Windows Hello provisioning after sign-in. So we can we could say, hey, the user's enabled, but don't force them to go through the process when they log in. It's kind of depends on your unique scenario, whether you use that option or not, but I'm going to leave it unchecked here because I do want my user to register at the time of sign-in versus having to go through a manual process on their own to try to trigger the event or to trigger the process. I don't want to put it in the hands of my user to do. I want to make the system enforce it. So I'm going to leave this box unchecked, and then I will hit apply. Now, if you recall my statement about Intune, we could technically push the same policy setting from Intune. But if you have multiple policies, so let's say we had the group policy and we also had an MDM policy defined, what happens when both of those are in place? Precedence does matter here, and it would be the user GPO overrides the computer GPO, which will override the user MDM, which will override the computer MDM. So it kind of flows down. If you have a user GPO policy defined, that will always override anything else that's defined. You have computer GPO, that will override anything MDM push down, but it won't override the user, and then so forth. But that's if you had Intune deployed, you can go through the configuration via Intune to push these same settings. So now that my policy is created and I've applied it to my OU, I may not want it to apply to all of my users in that OU, and that's where our security filtering comes into place, or our delegation. But in here in security filtering, I'm going to add in my Windows Hello for Business group that we just created as one of the first steps in the demo here. And remember, that only contains my one demo user. So if I had 20 users in this OU, only the members of this group then would be within scope. But another item that we need to do is come over here to delegation. And it doesn't matter what you select up here, we want to come down to advanced at the bottom right. We want to select authenticated users here now into security, and we want to uncheck apply group policy. And then we'll hit apply just to make sure that goes through. But then we want to select our Windows Hello for Business users and make sure that it does have apply group policy. So again, this is going to say, hey, all authenticated users don't get this policy. They can read it, they just won't apply it. But only my Windows Hello for Business users will apply my policy. Okay. So now we've scoped it down. All right. So let me pull this back up real quick, because we've got everything in place that we need now for Windows Hello to work. And what's going to happen in the background here when I do this demo is a lot of stuff, actually. If you remember our session from last week, we've already done the device registration. So that part's done. But for the credential registration, there's going to be several different moving parts. I'm going to have to authenticate to Azure AD. I'm going to get an access token from Azure AD. That's going to trigger the Windows Hello for Business process on my endpoint, which is going to enable the key pair creation within the TPM and the configuration of what's called a gesture, a means to unlock the TPM key credential. And then it's going to send that public key up to Azure AD. So a lot of that stuff is going to happen. But I just wanted to show that real quick here as a reminder of all those different things that take place kind of in the background, because it is sort of a quicker process that goes into place. So I'm going to go back to my endpoint here. I'll close out of this command prompt. Actually, I should have left it open, because what I'll do is I'm going to do a GP update course, because it is group policy based. Now, I should get that new policy when I log in again, but just in case, I'm going to do a GP update force. And I've actually seen this where it doesn't take the first time, so maybe we have to log in and log off once or twice for the process to kick off. But I should just have to log off and log back in, but I'm going to do a shutdown, restart, do it immediately. Since it's a VM, it runs pretty fast. But the Windows Hello for Business provisioning should occur at user login. So again, I'm already logging into this device with a credential that is tied to Active Directory, but that ID is also synchronized to Azure AD. The device is synchronized to Azure AD, and then the group policy is going to kind of trigger that setup of Windows Hello that tie into Azure AD. So let's cross our fingers and hope our policy went through. When I log in, I should get the Windows Hello for Business provisioning process startup, and I did not. So let me try one more time. Let me just make sure I did save that policy, right? I must have, because I closed out of the console. Okay. Let's try that one more time. All right. Hopefully this time the process will kick off and we'll walk through the setup process. One thing actually down here I'll point out in my VM, I'm going to disconnect this item. It's a USB-based fingerprint sensor. Because I want to walk through, let's connect to my host. I want to walk through the process of what this looks like if you don't have, maybe that didn't like that, if you don't have a biometric on your device. Maybe that was a mistake, because it looks like it's going to keep prompting me over and over. All right, just connect it back to the host, or the VM. All right, so let me log in here. So what I wanted to try to show is the setup if we didn't have a biometric. It would pretty much just default to a PIN. But since I do have that USB, it's going to say, hey, use your fingerprint. So the experience would have been a little bit different if I didn't have a biometric device like an infrared camera or a fingerprint sensor. But I do have a USB-based fingerprint sensor attached to this VM. So it's going to ask me to set up my fingerprint. Now I can skip this because a biometric is not required. A PIN is. So if I hit skip, it would just pretty much ask me to set up the PIN, but I'll go ahead and say yes, set up. I'll touch my sensor 40,000 times, register my fingerprint. Come on. And what this is doing is it's creating a gesture. I have to do a different angle now. A gesture that is used to unlock my credential in the TPM. This is nothing being sent to Azure. This is just my local device, my VM here using a virtual TPM essentially, to lock the TPM. Now, remember I did say that MFA is required to provision a Windows Hello for Business credential. So what is happening in the background, Windows 11 here is trying to authenticate to get an access token to my account up against Azure AD. Now, this is an account that unfortunately I did not register before the demo with MFA, so now I'm being prompted to set up MFA. But this does kind of point out a good concept here, and that is, with MFA, the first time you're prompted for MFA is when you're going to be set up for MFA, right? Instead of having to provide the code, now I'm being asked to set up the code. So it's probably a good idea to have your users pre-registered for MFA prior to trying to set up Windows Hello for Business. Otherwise, technically, they're setting up MFA and then providing MFA in the very same process as established in their Windows Hello for Business credential. But if I already had my Authenticator app set up, I would have just gotten a push notification, and I would have said accept, and then we would be seeing this screen. So now I have an MFA credential. I'm going to put in a PIN. And again, this PIN is device specific. This is not being set up to Azure AD. It's not being sent anywhere, not even being sent to Active Directory on-prem. It is device specific. It's a PIN that is used to unlock my credential now in my local device. And that's it. That was the registration. This device is now set up for Windows Hello for Business. It might not seem like much, right? If I log off here, actually, you know what? One thing I do have to do. So what has happened is it has written the key pair to Azure AD. So one thing I do want to take a look at, let me go back to my Directory Connect. So kind of like the device registration process where the device wrote a self-signed cert to Active Directory and we had to sync that up to Azure AD. We're kind of in the opposite boat here because what's happened is Windows Hello has written my public key to Azure AD, but it hasn't written it to on-prem Active Directory. So if I come in here and I say, you know what, let's do a run, I could just wait for a regular run cycle, but I want to kind of show what's happening here. I'm going to do a Delta import from my cloud connector, meaning I'm going to read in from Azure Active Directory or Azure AD into the metaverse here. And as you can see, I've got an update. And if I look at this, there is now this attribute that is being added called Searchable Device ID. Now, if you remember, we go back to Active Directory here. In my previous session, I was always referencing an attribute called MSDS key credential link. I have to enable the advanced features to see the attributes. So attribute editor, if I scroll down to my object MSDS, and be careful, there is an MS-DS, so we want to make sure we're grabbing the right one. MSDS key credential. So it's already been, did I miss a sync cycle? It's already been written back. So I wonder if look at my history here. Yeah, so it pretty much ran Directory Connect right after I did that credential registration. So what I'm actually looking at is what I would see after the full process has completed. This value typically would be blank until that synchronization run. But if you look here, I manually ran my Delta import at 20. No, it didn't. Oh, I'm sorry. I ran my Delta and then a regular sync occurred 27 seconds or 21 seconds after I ran my Delta. All right, so that's why we're seeing it. I ran my Delta import. At that time, this was blank. And then 21 seconds later, the scheduled task kicked off to run a regular sync. And if you look at the export here, not worried about that right now, but if I look at my on-prem, you see this update, and it is writing back to my user object. It is adding the MSDS key credential value, and there is my public key value that is now being written from Azure AD, the old value of 0 or blank, with the new value, which is the public key value. So that is how Active Directory knows about my credential. So now, if I wanted to log off from my endpoint and log back in, I can now just touch my fingerprint sensor, and it's logging me into Active Directory, and now it's logging me into Azure AD. So if I needed to access any on-prem app that uses AD integrated authentication, great. I've got a Kerberos ticket grant and ticket from Active Directory that enables me to do that. If I wanted to log into any Microsoft integrated cloud service, now I have a Windows primary refresh token that now contains my cloud credential. So now I have a single sign-on experience pretty much both on-prem and cloud. And that is the wrap up. I know we're at the hour, actually a couple minutes over the hour. So I do apologize for that. I had some other items that I was going to walk through here on kind of validating, seeing some of the event history on the device itself. But at the end of the day here, what we've seen is the registration process and the authentication using a Windows Hello for Business credential. So real quick, let me wrap up. We do have this was our part 2 of our Windows Hello for Business session. Our topic as part of our passwordless authentication series. We will be wrapping up our passwordless authentication series next week on Wednesday, where we will be going through the setup and configuration of the Authenticator app and the FIDO2 security keys. So join us for that to kind of see the last bits and pieces on how to make Windows Hello for Business a reality for your environment. But we've also announced, or are announcing today, I guess, our upcoming mini series, and that will be on Zero Trust with Microsoft Cloud Solutions. So our first session on that mini series will be June 1st. And we will be talking about Zero Trust with Microsoft Cloud, kind of an intro to Zero Trust and how Microsoft aligns its security capabilities to the Zero Trust practices and principles. And then the second session will be enabling identity and device policies for Zero Trust. We'll walk through some of the common and recommended policies that Microsoft has available to start implementing a Zero Trust approach into your environment, and then wrapping that up with a third session with aligning Defender solutions with Zero Trust. So if you're familiar with the Microsoft Cloud, pretty much all the security tools outside of Azure, well, even within Azure, have been rebranded underneath this Defender umbrella: Defender for Identity, Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Endpoints. How do those tie in or align in with Zero Trust? So join us or register for those using the QR code here. If you haven't registered using our link before, you can use that QR code with your phone, and then that'll take you to our registration link. Even if you register for the passwordless authentication series, you can use that same link to go back and then register for our upcoming series and get the invites to that. So with that, I will wrap up and appreciate everyone's time for joining in. Jim, were there any questions that came up that were unanswered in the Q&A?
I believe Jim had to drop, but there was only a single question that dealt with the URL for getting the previous recordings, which was answered. So no other questions came through.
Okay. Yeah, recordings are here. It's technically going to redirect you to a YouTube channel for us for improving. That'll have all of our previous, not just from this series, but from our prior series from previous years as well. So you'll see all of our CSP recordings up there. So. All right, great. Well, if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out at us at csp@improven.com. Hopefully this was beneficial for everyone on how to start taking steps towards initiating or enabling Windows Hello for Business passwordless authentication in their environment, even if it's just in a pilot or your IT team, right? So join us again for future technical discussions, and hopefully we can continue to help share our knowledge and expertise.